7:55 on a Sunday morning, a date we won't soon forget. December 7, 1941. 94 ships were in port at Pearl Harbor and thousands of men were on weekend liberty. When it was all over, the Pacific Fleet was all but wiped out. All 8 battleships were either sunk or severely damaged. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, a number of smaller vessels. The Japanese lost 28 planes and 5 midget submarines, and the war. This is the story of a group of men, sailors in green, who helped in that effort and have been helping ever since.
I am one of those men, Admiral Ben Morrell, Civil Engineer Corps, United States Navy, retired. The story is about that group of men, the U.S. Navy Seabees, the men who build and fight. The Japanese hit us hard at Pearl Harbor, and at the nearby airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, Bellows, and Iwo. Our diplomatic relations with Japan had been strained for some time, and many people expected trouble. But no one quite expected what happened on that sleepy Sunday morning. When the smoke cleared away and we took stock, we realized that the Pacific Fleet had been crippled badly and that our ability to retaliate quickly had been destroyed, and we were entering a major war.
Pacific, the struggle was to take the form of an island-hopping war, one in which bases were going to be as important as bullets. What was needed was a highway to victory across the Pacific. The need was apparent. Skilled construction workers who could fight as well as they could build. So on January 5, 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, the Navy authorized Admiral Morrell to form 3 construction battalions, and the U.S. Navy Seabees were born.
In forming the Seabees, we recruited plumbers, carpenters, heavy equipment operators, even clerks and school teachers. Their average age was 33. They might have looked a bit ragged, but they did the job. General MacArthur once said to me, "The only trouble with your Seabees is that I don't have enough of them."
The first test came less than 6 months after their activation, when the first unit came under fire. Only 3 weeks after the Marines hit the beach at Guadalcanal, the Seabees of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion came ashore. Their job was to convert a muddy landing strip at Henderson Field into an all-weather airfield that could handle anything up to and including the B-17, the famous flying fortress. The field was under frequent attack, but throughout the 3-month battle for Guadalcanal, the Seabees kept working and fighting. They kept the field open and operational, even at one point when Japanese troops were within 150 feet of the field. The story was repeated time and again throughout the Pacific. The Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas. The list was endless as American forces slowly moved across the Pacific.
In many cases, they literally moved on a piece of equipment, the now famous magic box. It was a 5 by 7 foot sealed steel box, and it proved to be the most versatile tool the Seabees had. It could be assembled in many different arrangements for many different uses. Pontoons, causeways, barges. You could even attach an outboard motor to make a sort of instant ferry or movable raft. The magic box was used a lot in the Pacific, but it really paid off in the European theater. They were used for causeways for the landing in Sicily, and at Normandy they were used to ferry men and supplies to Omaha and Utah beaches.
In Europe, Allied forces advanced on Berlin, and in the Pacific they moved closer and closer to Japan. By mid-1944, American forces had reached the Marianas, less than 2,000 miles from Japan itself. The Marines swarmed ashore, and close behind were the Seabees. Their assignment was to build the world's largest airbase.
It turned out to be the Seabees' largest single job during the war, and they worked. They worked hard on 10-hour shifts, day after day. The airfield at Tinian went down in the history books, not as the largest or the most difficult, but because it was from this field that the Enola Gay took off on August 6, 1945. The fire and flames which started at Pearl Harbor spread across the Pacific and made their way to Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
September 2, 1945. The formal surrender documents were signed. In a special radio broadcast to the American people, General MacArthur said, "Today the guns are silent. A great tragedy has ended. A great victory has been won." World War II was over. The Seabees joined thousands of their fellow fighting men for the big trip home. The peace, however, did not last long. 5 years later, the North Koreans swept across the 38th parallel, and Americans again were called to arms. On September 15, 1950, Seabees went ashore with the 1st Marine Division at Incheon. Once there, Seabees turned to their familiar activities, servicing airfields of various Marine Air groups, and building an advanced airfield near the 38th parallel. The deadline, 35 days. They finished it in 16. In Korea, as earlier, the Seabees heaved to and accomplished their task. During the late 50s and early 60s, the Seabees found other assignments in the Far East, in Southeast Asia, such as the construction of an important airfield at Nakhon Phanom in Thailand. Again, the familiar equipment was on the scene.
The real test of Seabee endurance and ingenuity came in Vietnam, in the jungles and swamps, in the heat, and under combat conditions. As a matter of fact, the South Vietnamese name for Seabee, when translated, means water beetle, and there was a good reason for that. They followed a familiar pattern and went ashore with the Marines, this time at Chu Lai. And once ashore, they went right to work transforming a barren beach and rolling sand dunes into a temporary runway. And of course, they did it. They finished the job in a back-breaking 23 days. Their work in Vietnam was some of the toughest the Seabees had been called upon to do. In many places, they literally had to create the soil on which to build. And despite problems of terrain, weather, disease, to mention nothing of the Viet Cong, they built and built and built. Another tough assignment was that of building a road up Monkey Mountain. Again, the familiar bulldozer and road grader went to work, and the road was completed. Along with the road job, the CBs even shaved 200 feet off the top of the mountain for a missile site. And when they did that, they turned to and built the missile installation itself, plus all the support facilities needed. All through, however, CBs have been more than builders. What they built by day, they often had to protect at night, under constant threat of attack. And at times the threat was made good. In October of 1965, they were building a 400-bed hospital at Da Nang when the VC unleashed a devastating mortar and gunfire attack. It all but destroyed the building. 2 CBs were killed and 93 others wounded. But the next morning, the men were back on the job, even some of the wounded, and the hospital was finished ahead of schedule.
Military support facilities, buildings, runways, storage areas, and fuel farms were only a part of the CB's accomplishments in Vietnam. They were busy in every area and combat zone from the I Corps and DMZ south to the Mekong Delta. They built hundreds of miles of roads and highways, cutting through jungles and mountains, and spanned uncounted bridges over waterways, rivers, and rice paddies. In 1969, when Vietnamization began, the CBs were again in the forefront. As the Vietnam Navy grew in number, they were joined in many cases by Vietnamese sailors to build new strategic naval bases throughout the country, some in the most hostile swamp-like mudflats in the Delta. By the fall of 1971, the last active construction battalion had left the combat zone. Reserves were released, and the construction force was decreased from the Vietnam high of 19 active battalions and 2 reserves to 10 battalions. Along with this peacetime realignment, the remaining battalions were deployed at Navy and Marine Corps installations around the world. Here, on this remote strip of coral and sand, the CBs went to work again. This is Diego Garcia, a tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, 1,000 miles from the nearest landmass, India. In a joint undertaking with the British, Diego Garcia is destined to become part of the Navy's worldwide communications network. There are no permanent harbor facilities, so ships have to anchor offshore, and freight is transferred in lighters. The island is almost all coral, so the CBs have to call on past experience in crushing the coral to provide surfacing material, a technique another generation of CBs perfected in the Pacific during World War II. Another problem, the stumps of coconut trees in the way of construction are too waterlogged for burning, so they're being left in place, many of them, and will be used for erosion control. When a support runway is completed, it will be lined with coconut stumps.
More than 30 years and 3 wars for the CBs, in some rough places of the world and under some pretty rough combat conditions. Those bees have chalked up an enviable record in working and fighting side by side with other Americans during those years. It's a sure bet that no one wants to be involved in a combat situation. But the CBs pitched in and were very much a part of something that had to be done. But that's far from the end of their story. They've built quite a name for themselves in an entirely different field, in the field of people-to-people activity. In Thailand, for example, the first CB civic action teams arrived in 1963, and they went right to work helping the people, doing almost anything and everything imaginable. They built roads. They designed and constructed complex drainage systems to drain the swampy land. They cleared land, lots of it. In one project, they cleared land for a school playground. While they were doing it, they noticed some curious bystanders, children who would eventually use the play yard. so their help was enlisted. In the process, the CBs and children of this community made some new friends. It was a real case of people-to-people action. CB teams were even involved in medical treatment for the Thais, ranging from the very old to the youngsters. No job was too large or too small in Thailand and later in Vietnam. The care of human beings became as important as construction.
The civic action concept has been tested in many parts of the world. In the trust territories of the Pacific, the CBs are working alongside the people on islands where their fathers fought: the Marianas, the Carolines, the Marshalls. In Micronesia, CBs respond to local initiative. The officer in charge of the team meets with the local or regional legislative body and determines its needs. They're discussed jointly, and together they plan ways to translate plans into action. A bridge on the island of Yak, connecting one part of the island with another, and providing, for the first time, a passage for vehicular traffic. Together, the legislative group and the officer plan projects, but they also do more. Together, they plan for activities that will help the Micronesians develop new skills. A small hospital, for instance, is actually built by the natives themselves, working under the instruction of two CBs who went to a remote village and lived among the people. Of course, there are times when the instructors stop their instruction and participate in the project. CBs not only become workers and instructors, but cultural ambassadors as well. And they frequently manage to introduce the natives to their favorite stateside sports.
The CBs are also called into action during times of natural disaster to help stricken people cope with the aftermath and to return to normal as quickly as possible. Haiti is a good example. They went there on a mercy mission, following on the heels of a ravaging hurricane that swept the island. The CBs came ashore with equipment and supplies. They helped establish a lifeline connection with the northern part of the island by building bridges and causeways and by restoring washed-out roads. They also helped the people of the island replenish their food supplies. Closer home, they were called out in force when Hurricane Camille struck the Gulf Coast in August of 1969. The storm slammed into the coast with very little warning, and the twisted wreckage of buildings and cars that was left in its wake was testimony enough to the brute force of the storm. As a matter of fact, the CBs were already there at Gulfport. They too were hard hit. It was a large area and damage was extensive. So first off, they moved out and set up a command post in the center of the most heavily damaged region. The logistics were overwhelming. Even communications was a problem. But they overcame it with their own communication system. Leaving their own damaged homes and their families behind, they went right to work, first caring for people, searching the rubble for casualties, and removing them for emergency medical treatment. Then came the long, tiresome job of clearing away the debris, tons of it. Homes, shopping centers, churches. It was rough work, and a lot to be done. After the initial work was completed, civilian teams moved in, and the CBs started on the job of repairing their own damaged buildings and homes. Another example of CB activity helping people in need.
Not all CB activity in recent years has been in the field of civic action work. They've also been busy on still another front, helping to advance our technological capabilities, and sometimes doing it underwater. The scene is in the U.S. Virgin Islands at St. John. There, CBs donned rubber suits and other diving gear to help in preparations for Project Tektite. It was a joint research project of the Navy, NASA, and the Interior Department, one in which 4 aquanauts were placed in isolation on the ocean floor for 60 days. The habitat was connected to the surface support barge with air, water, electrical, and communications cables, much like the umbilical support system for an astronaut's spacesuit. Seabees provided the equipment and manned the support bar. The Tektite project had two primary objectives: to conduct further research into marine biology and to study the reaction of men confined in a small space in a hostile environment. The lessons learned are being applied to further missions, underwater and in space. And the Seabees gained new and valuable experience in underwater construction.
Under the water, over the ice, the Seabees go anywhere. Back in 1947, they went south with the Byrd expedition to Antarctica, and they built everything from roads to runways, restrooms to hospitals. Each year they've returned, making a significant contribution to the exploration of this part of the world. A far cry from the South Pacific. In 1962, atomic power came to Antarctica, courtesy of the Seabees. This nuclear reactor was installed at McMurdo Station. It produces heat and electric power, and it also converts seawater to fresh water for drinking.
In another part of the world, a more familiar area, the Seabees at their own home port in Davisville, Rhode Island, were assigned the construction of an experimental dry dock system to lift a naval ship out of the water. The dry dock, called the AMI lift dock, is a sophisticated method which is based on a principle of operation that is quite simple: submerging a platform of connected pontoons and then raising it to the surface by pumping in air. However, the technology involved in the construction of the dry dock and control systems was a challenge for the Seabees. Completed, the lift dock consisted of several large pontoons with keel blocks mounted on top of the platform to support the ship. The pontoons were floated into place between the two access piers and submerged. Then the ship, the USS Niblack, was brought into position exactly over the underwater assembly, and the test began. Water was expelled from the pontoons by pumping air in, and with the help of the winch controls, the entire assembly was lifted. In slightly less than 2 hours, the Niblack was fully raised out of the water, a total of 17 feet. The success of the test not only proved the lift dock concept, but demonstrated again the Seabees' capability to respond to even more complicated and technical construction projects.
And that's the Seabee story. Like all stories that have to be told in a short length of time, many elements, many details had to be left out. But the message is there. As a matter of fact, that message can also be found in a different medium, with different details, but it's the same message. The medium is a huge memorial, a bronze mural, and a statue to honor the Seabees of history. The man responsible is sculptor Felix de Weldon, and there's a lot of him invested in this memorial. Mr. de Weldon joined the Navy and became a Seabee himself shortly after the outbreak of World War II. He wasn't even a citizen of the United States, but he wanted to help, and he made a big contribution. Now there's another. The memorial gives us a sort of panorama of Seabee activities over the years. The men who built and fought and helped others. And when you look at it closely, you get the message. No words are necessary.
Mr. Brown and Mr. Jones, the oars and cones of flint. The Navy wanted more of Uncle Sammy's skin. So we all joined on and going we're in to win. We're the Seabees of the Navy. We can build and...
The man made famous by his Iwo Jima memorial to the Marines now turns his attention to those he knows best, the Seabees. I said a few moments ago that that's the Seabee story. But if I know the Seabees, it's far from the end of their story. The bees of World War II, who sweated it out in the jungles of the South Pacific, or who brought Allied supplies ashore at Normandy, and who did 1,000 other things. They've been followed by younger men, and they in turn have been followed by men younger than themselves. Today's Seabees have a different assignment. but they still work, perform, and serve in the spirit of can-do. And my pride in having been a part of that team is greater than ever.
The Navy wanted men, that's when we came in. Mr. Brown and Mr. Jones.